The lights in Murphy's bar were dim and smoky. Jake Morrison sat alone at a corner table, his metal fingers wrapped around a glass of cheap whiskey. The artificial gravity on Harmony Point made everything feel heavy, but Jake knew the real weight came from somewhere else entirely. His left arm was completely mechanical now. The doctors had done their best, but Zephyrian plasma burns went too deep. The metal fingers worked fine, but they felt cold against the warm glass. Jake took another sip and watched the other patrons through tired eyes. Harmony Point was supposed to be neutral territory, a place where all the species could meet and trade without fighting. The massive space station orbited between 3 star systems, right in the middle of nowhere. It was perfect for business, but Jake hated it. Too many aliens, too many memories. The war had been over for 2 years now. The Terran-Zephyrian War, they called it in the history books. 3 years of hell that nobody wanted to talk about anymore. Everyone just wanted to move on and pretend it never happened. Everyone except the veterans who lived through it. Jake was about to order another drink when he heard voices approaching his table. Young voices, speaking in different languages, but using the universal translator. He looked up and saw 3 alien cadets walking toward him. They wore the blue uniforms of the Galactic Coalition Academy. The first one was tall and thin with crystal-like skin that caught the bar lights. An Altarian, Jake recognized. They were known for being curious about everything. This one looked nervous but determined. The second was shorter and stockier with thick gray skin and small tusks. A Drakmarian warrior in training, Jake could tell by the way he walked. Drakmarians were proud of their fighting traditions and honor codes. This one looked like he thought he knew everything about war. The third was the strangest, a tentacled creature from the ocean worlds with big dark eyes and skin that changed colors. An oceanic. They were usually the smart ones in any group. The Altarian spoke first. "Excuse me, sir. Are you Commander Jake Morrison of the Earth Defense Force?" Jake looked at them for a long moment. "I was. Now I'm just Jake. What do you want?" 3 cadets exchanged glances. The Oceanic stepped forward. "My name is Nix. This is Velth." He pointed to the Altarian. "And this is Kos." He indicated the Drakmarian. "We're students at the Academy. We've heard stories about the war between humans and the Zephyrians." "Everyone's heard stories," Jake said. He finished his whiskey and set the glass down hard. "Doesn't mean they're true." Kos stepped forward, his tusks gleaming in the dim light. "We've studied the official reports. The humans were outnumbered 10 to 1. Your technology was inferior. By all military logic, you should have lost within months." Jake's eyes narrowed. "But we didn't lose, did we?" "No," Velth said quietly. "You won. We want to understand how." Jake laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You want to understand? You're just kids playing at being soldiers. You don't know what war really is." Kos's skin flushed darker. "I am a warrior of Drakmarn. My people have fought with honor for 1,000 years. We understand war." "Honor," Jake repeated. He called the bartender over and ordered another whiskey. "That's your problem right there. You think war is about honor." The 3 cadets looked confused. Nix's tentacles moved in what Jake recognized as a nervous gesture. "Isn't it? Fighting for what's right? Protecting your people?" "Maybe it starts that way," Jake said. "But it doesn't stay that way. Not when you're losing. Not when the enemy is trying to wipe out your entire species." He looked at each of them, in turn. "You really want to know how humans fight? You want to understand what happened during the war?" The 3 cadets nodded eagerly. Jake could see the curiosity in their eyes. They thought they were going to hear heroic stories about brave humans fighting against impossible odds. They thought war was like the movies they watched at the Academy. "Sit down," Jake said. "But I'm warning you now. These aren't stories about heroes. They're not tales of glory and honor. They're about what happens when you push humans too far, when you make them desperate." The cadets sat down around the table. Velth's crystal skin was glowing faintly with excitement. Kos looked proud, like he was about to learn secret warrior techniques. Nix was taking notes on a small device. Jake waited until the bartender brought his drink. He took a sip and stared at the three young faces watching him. The Zephyrians started the war, he began. They attacked our colonies without warning. Killed millions of civilians. They thought humans were weak because we were new to space travel. We know this part, Koss said impatiently. Tell us about the battles, the tactics. Jake's metal fingers tapped against his glass. The first battle was at Kepler Station. The Zephyrians sent 1,000 ships, we had 50. They destroyed our fleet in 6 hours. Then they landed on the station and started killing everyone they found. The cadets leaned forward. This was what they expected to hear. The station commander was Captain Lisa Hayes. She had 300 soldiers and about 2,000 civilians to protect. The Zephyrians had 10,000 warriors. What would you do in that situation? Velth thought for a moment. Try to evacuate. The civilians? No ships left, Jake said. They were all destroyed. Koss straightened up. Fight with honor. Make the enemy pay for every step. That's what Hayes thought at first, Jake said. She set up defensive positions. Tried to fight. Fair. Lost half her soldiers in the first day. Nix's tentacles moved thoughtfully. What did she do then? Jake's eyes went distant. She stopped fighting fair. That's when I learned my first lesson about how humans really fight. We don't fight to win battles. We fight to survive. And when survival is on the line, there are no rules. He took another drink and continued. Hayes called all her soldiers together, told them they were going to do things that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. But if they didn't do those things, they wouldn't have lives to be haunted. The bar around them seemed to grow quieter. Other patrons were leaving, heading, back to their ships or their quarters. Jake noticed but didn't care. He was already lost in the memories. The Zephyrians had a code of honor too, he said. They believed in fair combat, warrior against warrior. They didn't attack civilians directly. They tried to take prisoners when they could. They thought war was a game with rules. Koss nodded approvingly. As it should be. Jake looked at him with cold eyes. Hayes threw out the rulebook. She mixed civilians with soldiers so the Zephyrians couldn't tell them apart. She booby-trapped the bodies of dead humans so they would explode when the enemy tried to move them. She used children as messengers because the Zephyrians wouldn't shoot at them. The cadets were starting to look uncomfortable. Velth's glow was fading. Nix had stopped taking notes. But that's not the worst part, Jake continued. The worst part was what happened when the Zephyrians adapted, when they started shooting at everything that moved, when they stopped trying to take prisoners. He finished his whiskey and stared at the empty glass. That's when Hayes knew she had them, because once they started acting like humans, she knew they would lose. Humans had been preparing for this kind of war for thousands of years. We knew how to fight dirty. We knew how to make the enemy hate us so much that they would make mistakes. The three cadets sat in silence. Jake could see the questions in their eyes, but he wasn't ready to answer them yet. You wanted to know how humans fight, he said quietly. You wanted to understand what happened during the war. But you're not ready for the truth. None of you are. He stood up and dropped some credits on the table. Come back tomorrow if you really want to hear the rest. But remember, once you know what humans are capable of, you can't unknow it. And you'll never look at us the same way again. Jake walked away, leaving the three young aliens sitting in stunned silence. Behind him, he could hear them whispering to each other in their native languages. He knew they would be back tomorrow. Curiosity was stronger than fear, especially in the young. But as he walked through the corridors of Harmony Point, Jake wondered if he was making a mistake. The galaxy was at peace now. Maybe some truths were better left buried. Maybe some stories were too dangerous to tell. He touched his metal arm and felt the familiar coldness. No, he decided. The galaxy needed to know. They needed to understand what they were dealing with when they dealt with humans. Because someday, there might be another war. And when that day came, they would need to know what humans were capable of when pushed to the edge. The peace wouldn't last forever, it never did. The next evening, Jake found the 3 alien cadets waiting for him at the same table in Murphy's bar. They looked nervous, but determined. Velth's crystal skin was dim. Koss sat straighter than usual, and Nix's tentacles moved in slow, anxious patterns. Jake ordered his whiskey and sat down without saying hello. He studied their faces for a long moment. "You came back. We need to understand," Nix said quietly. "Our professors at the academy don't teach us about the real war. They just show us battle maps and casualty numbers. Numbers don't tell the whole story," Jake agreed. He took a sip of his drink. "You want to know about Titan Base?" The 3 cadets nodded. They had obviously done research since yesterday. Titan Base was mentioned in all the military textbooks, but the details were classified. Jake's metal fingers drummed against the table. "I was 22 years old. Lieutenant Morrison, fresh out of the academy myself. I thought I knew what war was like." He laughed bitterly. "The Zephyrians taught me otherwise." He looked around the bar. It was quieter tonight, with fewer patrons. Good. This story wasn't for everyone to hear. "Titan Base was our main supply depot in the Outer Rim," Jake began. "Captain Lisa Hayes commanded the garrison. 300 soldiers, mostly support staff. Mechanics, medics, supply clerks, not frontline fighters." Koss leaned forward. "How many Zephyrians attacked?" 10,000 warriors, their entire 3rd battle swarm." Jake's eyes grew distant. "They came in fast, destroyed our defensive satellites before we could react, cut off all communications with Earth. We were completely surrounded." Velth's glow flickered. "What did Captain Hayes do?" "At first, she tried to fight like they taught us at the academy. Set up defensive positions in the outer corridors. Posted guards at choke points, organized patrols." Jake shook his head. "We lost 50 soldiers in the first day. The Zephyrians were too strong, too fast, too many." He took another drink, remembering. That night, Hayes called all the remaining officers together. I'll never forget what she said. "Gentlemen, we're going to lose this base. The question is whether we make them pay a price they can't afford." Nix was taking notes again. "What did she mean?" "She meant we were going to stop fighting fair." Jake's voice grew harder. "Hayes divided us into small teams, told us to forget everything we learned about honorable combat. Our new job was to make the Zephyrians afraid to walk through their own conquered territory." The cadets exchanged glances. This wasn't what they expected to hear. Jake continued. "The Zephyrians had honor codes. They didn't kill surrendering enemies. They tried to avoid destroying food and medical supplies. They even had rules about not fighting in certain areas like hospitals." "That sounds civilized," Velth said hopefully. "Hayes threw out civilization on day 2. Jake's metal fingers tightened around his glass. "She ordered us to booby-trap the medical bay. Anyone who tried to help wounded Zephyrians would trigger explosives." Koss looked confused. "But that would kill your own wounded too." "That was the point," Jake said quietly. "Hayes moved all our wounded to a hidden bunker. Left the medical bay empty except for bombs. When the Zephyrians brought their injured there, they walked into a trap." The silence at the table stretched. Uncomfortably, Nix's tentacles had stopped moving entirely. "But that wasn't the worst part," Jake continued. "Hayes recorded the screams of the Zephyrians who survived the explosion. Then she broadcast those screams through the base's communication system, 24 hours a day. The sound of their own people dying in agony." Velth's crystal skin had gone completely dark. "Why would she do that?" "Psychology," Jake explained. "Zephyrians are hive-minded. They feel each other's pain. Hearing their comrades suffer drove them crazy. They started making mistakes, getting angry instead of thinking clearly." He remembered those days with perfect clarity. The screams echoing through the corridors. The look in Hayes's eyes as she watched the enemy fall apart. The way his own hand shook the first time he triggered a booby trap. "Hayes taught us new tactics every day," Jake said. "We learned to pretend we were dead, then attack when Zephyrians walked past. We learned to rig our own equipment to explode when the enemy tried to use it. We learned to use their honor against them." "How?" Koss asked, though he looked like he didn't really want to know. Zephyrians never shot at someone who was surrendering, so we taught our people to surrender, get close to enemy groups, then detonate hidden grenades. Jake's voice was flat, emotionless. Private Danny Cole volunteered for one of those missions. He was 19 years old, walked into a group of 50 Zephyrians with his hands up. Jake paused to finish his whiskey. Danny took out all 50 of them. The explosion could be heard 3 levels away. The 3 cadets sat in stunned silence. Finally, Nix spoke. "How many of your people volunteered for missions like that?" "All of them," Jake said simply. By week 3, everyone understood. We weren't fighting to win the base back. We were fighting to make sure the Zephyrians would think twice before attacking the next human outpost. He signaled the bartender for another drink. Haze kept escalating. When the Zephyrians stopped entering our medical areas, she booby-trapped the food storage. When they stopped taking our equipment, she rigged the air recycling systems. Koss looked sick. "You poisoned the air?" "Not poisoned. Turned off." Haze sealed us into environmental suits and cut the life support. When the Zephyrians tried to breathe the air in captured sections, they found nothing but vacuum. Jake's new drink arrived. He stared at it without taking a sip. By week 4, the Zephyrians were afraid to occupy any part of the base. They controlled the territory, but they couldn't use it. Every door might be trapped. Every piece of equipment might explode. Every corridor might be filled with poison. Gas. "How long did this continue?" Velth asked weakly. 6 weeks total. The Zephyrians sent for reinforcements twice. Even with 15,000 warriors, they couldn't secure the base. Haze had turned their victory into a nightmare. Jake finally took a sip of his drink. The end came when Haze realized we were running out of supplies. No food, no ammunition, no medical supplies. We had maybe 3 days left. The cadets leaned forward despite their obvious discomfort. They needed to know how it ended. Haze gathered the surviving soldiers. Maybe 50 of us left out of 300. She told us about the mining tunnels that connected to the old asteroid processing plant, a way out that the Zephyrians hadn't discovered. Jake's metal fingers traced patterns on the table. But first she was going to give the Zephyrians one final lesson about fighting humans. "What did she do?" Nix whispered. "She rigged the base's fusion reactor to overload." Jake looked at each of them in turn. Haze planned to take out the entire Zephyrian force, 10,000 warriors, their ships, everything. Koss's tusks were showing as his mouth hung open. "All of them?" Haze called it the only honorable thing to do. "The Zephyrians had fought bravely," she said. "They deserved to die like warriors, not be picked off one by traps and tricks." Jake remembered the evacuation clearly, crawling through narrow mining tunnels while the reactor countdown ticked away behind them. Haze stayed behind to make sure the timer worked properly. We made it to the processing plant with minutes to spare. Watched through the observation windows as Titan Base turned into a small sun. The explosion took out the entire Zephyrian third battle swarm. Not a single enemy ship escaped. The silence stretched for a long time. Finally, Velth spoke. "What happened to Captain Haze?" "She died with the base. Found her body in the reactor control room after the war ended. Still at her post." Jake raised his glass in a small salute. The Zephyrians never attacked another human supply depot. Word spread through their entire military. Humans would rather destroy everything than let it be captured. Koss finally found his voice. "Was it worth it? All those deaths for one base?" Jake's eyes were cold. That one base saved millions of human lives. The Zephyrians learned they couldn't just overwhelm our positions with numbers. Every human base might be another Titan. Every victory might cost them their entire attacking force. He finished his drink and stood up. "You wanted to understand how humans fight, now you're starting to see. We don't fight to capture territory or win glory. We fight to make war so expensive for our enemies that they'll prefer peace." The 3 cadets remained seated as Jake walked toward the exit. Behind him, he could hear them talking in hushed voices. Velth sounded scared. Koss sounded confused. Nix sounded thoughtful. At the door, Jake turned back. "Tomorrow I'll tell you about Operation Midnight Sun, about what happens when humans take the war to the enemy's home. But I'll warn you again. Each story gets worse. You can stop now if you want." None of them answered, but Jake knew they would be back. The curiosity was too strong now. They needed to know how deep the darkness went. As he walked through the corridors of Harmony Point, Jake wondered if Hayes would have approved of him telling these stories. She had died to protect humanity's secrets as much as to destroy the enemy. But the war was over now. The galaxy needed to understand what they were dealing with. Peace was fragile. It only lasted as long as everyone remembered why they wanted to avoid war. Jake's stories were a reminder, a warning written in blood and fire. The next story would be even harder to tell. Jake arrived at Murphy's bar to find the 3 alien cadets already waiting. They looked different tonight. Velth's crystal skin was dull and gray. Koss sat hunched over instead of proud and straight. Nix's tentacles moved in nervous, jerky patterns. "You came back again," Jake said as he sat down. The bartender brought his whiskey without being asked. "We talked to our professors," Nix said quietly, "about Titan Base. They said the official reports were classified for good reason." Jake smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Smart professors. Some truths are too dangerous for textbooks." Velth leaned forward. "They said what you told us couldn't be true, that no civilized species would fight that way." "Civilized," Jake repeated. He took a long sip of his whiskey. "That's the problem with the rest of the galaxy. You think civilization and survival are the same thing. Humans learned better." Koss looked uncomfortable. "My people have fought wars for centuries. We follow codes of honor, rules that separate warriors from monsters." "Your people never faced extinction," Jake said flatly. "When the Zephyrians started the war, they weren't trying to conquer us. They were trying to wipe us out completely. Every man, woman, and child. When survival is at stake, honor becomes a luxury you can't afford." He looked around the bar. Even fewer patrons tonight. Word was spreading that the human veteran was telling stories. Most species preferred not to hear them. "You want to know about Operation Midnight Sun?" Jake asked. The 3 cadets nodded, though they didn't look eager anymore. Jake stared into his glass. The war had been going for 18 months. We were losing badly. The Zephyrians had superior numbers, better technology, and they controlled most of the outer systems. Earth's government was talking about surrender terms. He paused, remembering those dark days. That's when Colonel Steve Parker came up with his plan. Instead of fighting the Zephyrian military, he wanted to attack their civilians. Velth's skin flickered with shock. Attack non-combatants? That's against every rule of war. Parker said rules were written by winners, Jake replied. He studied Zephyrian psychology for months, learned how their hive mind society worked, found their weak points. Jake had been part of the briefing where Parker explained his strategy. The colonel had been calm, methodical, terrifying in his precision. Zephyrians live in massive city hives, Jake continued. Millions of individuals connected by telepathic links. They share emotions, thoughts, even pain. Parker realized that attacking their infrastructure wouldn't just hurt them physically, it would damage their minds. Koss's tusks were showing as he grimaced. What kind of infrastructure? Power grids first. Zephyrian cities run on bioelectric energy. Cut the power and their telepathic networks start failing. Individuals get disconnected from the hive mind. They panic. Jake remembered the mission briefings. 12 volunteers, all unmarried, no families, all expendable. He had volunteered too, but Parker turned him down. Said he was too valuable as a regular soldier. Parker took 11 other humans to the Zephyrian homeworld. They used captured enemy ships and forged identification codes. Spent 2 months infiltrating different city hives. Nix was taking notes again, but his tentacles shook as he wrote. How did they avoid detection? Zephyrians never expected enemies to attack their home planet. Their security was designed to keep order among their own people, not to stop foreign infiltrators. Jake's voice grew colder. Parker's team studied Zephyrian behavior patterns, learned to mimic their movements, their social signals. The plan had been brilliant and horrible. Jake still remembered the reports that came back through coded transmissions. The first target was the central power hub in New Zephyr City. 20 million Zephyrians lived there. When the power grid failed, the entire population lost their telepathic connection at once. Jake paused to take another drink. Imagine suddenly losing your ability to think clearly, to communicate with your family, to feel connected to anyone else. That's what happened to 20 million beings in a single moment. Velth's glow had disappeared completely. They died? Worse. They went insane. Zephyrians without hive mind connection, become terrified, violent, unpredictable. The city tore itself apart in 3 days. Nobody had to fire a shot. Koss looked sick. Parker did this to multiple cities? 7 major population centers over 2 months. Each time, his team would disable the power grid, then disappear before local authorities could respond. By the time repair crews fixed the systems, the psychological damage was done. Jake remembered watching the intelligence reports, video footage of Zephyrian cities in chaos, citizens attacking each other in confusion and terror, emergency services overwhelmed, the hive mind society collapsing under its own fear. But Parker wasn't finished, Jake continued. Phase 2 targeted communication networks. Zephyrians use bioacoustic transmitters to coordinate between different hive cities. Parker's team planted viruses in these systems. Viruses? Nix asked. Computer. Programs designed to corrupt telepathic signals. Instead of sharing thoughts and emotions, the transmitters started broadcasting fear, pain, and confusion. The Zephyrian homeworld's entire communication grid became a torture device. The silence at the table was complete. Even the background noise of the bar seemed muted. Phase 3 was food distribution, Jake said quietly. Zephyrians grow food in massive biofarms. Parker's team didn't destroy the farms. They contaminated them with psychoactive chemicals. Velth found her voice. You poisoned their food supply? Not poisoned. The chemicals weren't lethal. They caused hallucinations, paranoia, and aggressive behavior. A population already traumatized by power failures and communication breakdowns started eating food that made them violently unstable. Jake had read the after-action reports. The clinical language couldn't hide the horror of what Parker's team had accomplished. The Zephyrian homeworld descended into complete chaos. Their military had to withdraw entire fleets from the front lines to restore order at home. But every time they fixed one problem, Parker's team created 3 more. Koss was staring at his hands. How long did this continue? 2 months of active operations. But Parker left behind something special before his team extracted. Jake's smile was sharp and cruel. Data caches programmed to activate randomly over the following years. What kind of data? Nix asked, though he looked like he didn't want to know. False emergency broadcasts, fake news reports about new attacks, computer viruses that would randomly shut down power grids for a few minutes at a time. Jake leaned back in his chair. Parker turned the entire Zephyrian homeworld into a population suffering from permanent psychological trauma. The 3 cadets sat in stunned silence. Finally, Velth spoke. The Zephyrians must have retaliated. They tried, sent assassination teams to Earth, attempted to poison our water supplies, but they were thinking like warriors. Parker was thinking like a human. Jake finished his whiskey and signaled for another. Humans had been studying psychological warfare for centuries. We knew how to break minds as well as bodies. The Zephyrians didn't even have words for the concepts Parker was using against them. What happened to Colonel Parker? Koss asked. He survived the war, got promoted to general. Last I heard, he was teaching at the Earth Military Academy. Jake's new drink arrived. The techniques he developed are now standard doctrine for asymmetric warfare. Nix looked up from his notes. You mean other humans are learning these methods? Every officer in the Earth Defense Force studies Operation Midnight Sun. It's considered one of the most successful military campaigns in human history. Jake took a sip of his fresh drink. 12 people broke the will of an entire planet without firing a single shot in direct combat. The implications hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Velth was the first to voice what they were all thinking. If 12 humans could do that to the Zephyrian homeworld, what could a larger force accomplish? Jake's eyes were cold as winter. That's the question that ended the war. The Zephyrian Empire realized they weren't just fighting human soldiers. They were fighting human imagination, human creativity, human willingness to do whatever it takes to survive. He stood up and dropped credits on the table. Tomorrow I'll tell you about the Reaper Protocol, about what happens when humans decide that some victories require the ultimate sacrifice. As Jake walked toward the exit, he could hear the three cadets whispering urgently to each other. Their voices carried fear now, not curiosity. They were beginning to understand what they had asked to learn. At the door, Jake paused. You can still stop coming. Some knowledge can't be unlearned. Once you know what humans are truly capable of, you'll never feel safe around us again. None of them answered, but Jake knew they would return. The horror was too fascinating now. They needed to know how deep the darkness went. Outside in the corridor, Jake touched his metal arm and felt the familiar coldness. Parker's methods had saved millions of human lives, but they had also revealed something about humanity that perhaps should have stayed hidden. The galaxy was learning what humans were capable of. Jake wondered if that knowledge would keep the peace or destroy it. Jake walked into Murphy's bar and stopped. The three alien cadets were there, but they looked like they hadn't slept in days. Velth's crystal skin was completely colorless. Koss slumped in his chair like a defeated warrior. Nix's tentacles hung limp and motionless. Our professors want to see us, Velth said as Jake sat down. They're asking questions about what we've been learning. Jake ordered his whiskey. Smart professors. They probably know where this is heading. Do you have to tell us the next story? Koss asked. His voice was barely a whisper. Can't we stop here? Jake studied the young Drakmarian's face. You can leave anytime you want, but if you stay, you need to understand everything. Half-truths are more dangerous than complete knowledge. Nix looked up with tired eyes. What's the Reaper Protocol? Jake was quiet for a long time. When his drink arrived, he held it without taking a sip. The darkest chapter of the war, the moment when humanity proved we would do absolutely anything to survive. The bar around them was nearly empty tonight. Word had spread through Harmony Point about the human veteran and his stories. Most aliens avoided Murphy's bar now. The war had been going for 2.5 years, Jake began. The Zephyrians were desperate. Their homeworld was in chaos because of Parker's operation. Their military was stretched thin. So they tried something new. He paused, remembering the intelligence reports that had changed everything. They captured the colony world of New Boston. 50,000 human civilians lived there. Farmers, miners, teachers, children. The Zephyrians didn't kill them right away. Velth leaned forward despite her obvious fear. What did they do? Biological weapons research. The Zephyrians had captured human scientists during earlier battles, forced them to create diseases that would only affect humans. They needed test subjects. Jake's metal fingers tightened around his glass. New Boston became a laboratory. The Zephyrians infected different groups of colonists with different experimental viruses, studied how the diseases spread, how quickly humans died, how much pain they could cause. The three cadets looked sick. Koss's tusks were grinding together. Nix had stopped breathing normally. Earth Command received reports from the few colonists who managed to hide radio transmitters. We heard about the experiments, the children being used as test subjects, the way diseases were designed to cause maximum suffering before death. Jake finally took a sip of his whiskey. It tasted like ashes. Admiral Kate Foster was in charge of the rescue mission. She assembled the largest fleet Earth had ever sent into enemy territory. 300 ships, 50,000 Marines, everything we could spare. He remembered Foster from the command briefings, a small woman with gray hair and eyes like steel. She had lost her own family in an earlier Zephyrian attack, but Foster knew the fleet couldn't reach New Boston in time. The trip would take 3 weeks. Intelligence said the experiments would be finished in 10 days. All 50,000 colonists would be dead, and the Zephyrians would have their biological weapons. Jake stared into his drink. That's when Foster activated the Reaper Protocol. What is that? Velth whispered. A contingency plan, created during the first year of the war when we realized how desperate things might become. Jake's voice became mechanical, emotionless. The protocol authorized the use of biological weapons against human populations to prevent their capture and use by enemy forces. The silence at the table was complete. Jake could hear his own heartbeat. Foster sent a single ship to New Boston, the destroyer USS Providence, commanded by Alex Turner. His mission was to deploy a biological agent that would kill every human on the planet within 6 hours. Koss found his voice. Kill your own people? The virus was designed by human scientists specifically for this purpose. It targeted human DNA exclusively, completely harmless to other species but 100% fatal to humans. Quick death, no suffering. Jake remembered Turner from their academy days, a good man who believed in protecting civilians. The worst possible choice for the mission, which made him the only choice. Turner and his crew knew exactly what they were being asked to do. Murder 50,000 innocent humans to prevent them from being tortured to death by aliens. There was no good choice. He took another drink. The flight to New Boston took 36 hours. Turner spent that time recording personal messages for every colonist family. He took responsibility for each death, made sure their families would know that someone cared about their sacrifice. The cadet sat frozen. Velth was crying, though her species had no tears. The colors in her crystal skin shifted between gray and black. Turner deployed the biological weapon from orbit, a single missile that spread the virus through New Boston's atmosphere. Within 6 hours, every human on the planet was dead. Jake's memory supplied details he wished he could forget. The reports from surveillance satellites, empty cities, silent schools, playgrounds where no children would ever play again. When the Zephyrian research teams came to collect their test subjects, they found corpses, 50,000 dead humans, and no way to continue their experiments. The biological weapons program was shut down permanently. Nix's tentacles were trembling. How did the crew handle it, knowing they had killed so many innocents? Badly. Turner lost 12 crew members to suicide before they returned to Earth. He tried to court-martial himself for war crimes. Foster refused to accept his resignation. Jake finished his whiskey and stared at the empty glass. Turner spent the rest of the war in a psychiatric facility. The guilt destroyed his mind. He kept seeing the faces of the colonists he had killed, children especially. Koss was staring at his hands. There had to be another way. The Zephyrians thought so, too. They sent negotiators to Earth Command, demanded to know what kind of monsters would murder their own people rather than let them be captured. Jake's laugh was bitter and hollow. Foster's response became famous throughout the galaxy. She told them that humans would rather see their children dead than enslaved, that we would burn our own worlds before letting enemies use them against us. The implications hung in the air like poison gas. Velth spoke first. You would really destroy everything rather than lose? The Reaper Protocol wasn't just about New Boston. It was about sending a message. Every human colony, every human world, every human space station had the capability to self-destruct rather than be captured. Jake signaled for another drink. The protocol included instructions for civilian populations. If capture was imminent, they were supposed to activate hidden biological weapons and kill themselves. Quick, clean death instead of torture and experimentation. Nix looked horrified. How many colonies had these weapons? All of them. Every human settlement outside Earth's solar system. Foster made sure the Zephyrians knew this. She broadcast the protocol specifications on open channels so enemy intelligence would intercept them. The new drink arrived. Jake stared at it without touching it. The psychological impact was immediate. Zephyrian commanders realized they couldn't capture any human territory without finding empty planets full of corpses. Every victory would be hollow. Every conquest would be useless. Koss finally looked up. Did any other colonies use the protocol? 3 more. The Zephyrians tried to capture research stations at Alpha Centauri, Wolf 359, and Proxima Base. Each time, The colonists activated the biological weapons rather than surrender. Each time the Zephyrians found nothing but dead humans. Jake's voice grew quieter. 15,000 more people, scientists, engineers, families, all dead by their own choice rather than risk being used as weapons against their own species. The three cadets sat in stunned silence. Finally, Velth found her voice. How could anyone make that choice? Because they understood what was at stake. If the Zephyrians developed effective biological weapons using human test subjects, they could wipe out every human world. 15,000 deaths to prevent billions of deaths. Jake picked up his fresh drink but didn't taste it. Foster kept detailed records of every person who died under the Reaper Protocol. She visited their families personally after the war, explained why their loved ones had to die. What did she tell them? Nix asked. The truth, that their children saved humanity by choosing death over slavery, that their sacrifice prevented the total extinction of our species. Jake stood up and dropped credits on the table. Tomorrow I'll tell you the final story, about the price we paid for victory, about what happens to a species that wins a war by becoming something monstrous. As he walked toward the exit, Jake could hear the cadets whispering urgently. Their voices carried desperation now. They wanted to understand, but understanding was destroying them. At the door, Jake turned back one last time. The Reaper Protocol is still active. Every human colony still has those weapons, still has the orders to use them rather than surrender. Foster made sure the galaxy would never forget what humans are willing to do. He left them sitting in the darkness, wrestling with knowledge that would haunt them forever. Outside in the corridor, Jake touched his metal arm and felt the familiar coldness. The war was over, but its lessons remained. Humanity had proven they would rather die than lose. The galaxy was still learning what that really meant. Jake arrived at Murphy's bar for the last time. The three alien cadets were waiting, but they looked like different beings than the eager young students who had approached him 5 days ago. Velth's crystal skin was cracked and dim. Koss sat, hunched over like an old man. Nix's tentacles moved in slow, defeated patterns. You came back, Jake said as he sat down. His usual whiskey was already waiting. We had to, Velth said quietly. We need to know how it ends. Jake looked around. The bar. It was completely empty except for them and the bartender who stayed far away from their table. The stories had spread through Harmony Point. Most aliens refused to come near the human veteran now. How it ends, Jake repeated. He took a sip of his whiskey. The war ended 6 months after the Reaper Protocol was activated. The Zephyrian Empire surrendered unconditionally. Koss looked up with hollow eyes. They were afraid of you. Terrified, Jake confirmed. They realized they weren't fighting a normal enemy. They were fighting a species that would literally destroy itself rather than lose. A species with no limits, no boundaries, no lines they wouldn't cross. He stared into his glass, remembering the day the peace treaty was signed. There had been no celebrations on Earth, no parades or victory speeches, just exhausted silence. The surrender came through normal diplomatic channels. The Zephyrian Emperor himself appeared on interstellar communication networks. He announced that his people could not continue fighting an enemy that valued death over defeat. Nix was taking notes, but his tentacles shook so badly he could barely write. What were the peace terms? Complete withdrawal from all human territory, payment of war reparations, dismantling of their military research programs. And one more thing. Jake's voice grew harder. The Zephyrians had to publicly broadcast detailed accounts of human warfare methods to every species in the galaxy. Velth's broken skin flickered weakly. Why? So everyone would know. So every potential enemy would understand exactly what they would face if they attacked humanity. The Zephyrians became our unwilling ambassadors, spreading the word about human capabilities. Jake remembered watching those broadcasts. Zephyrian military commanders describing Titan Base with trembling voices. Scientists explaining Operation Midnight Sun while their own hands shook. Diplomats recounting the Reaper Protocol as if they were confessing to crimes. The broadcast worked. No species has declared war on humanity since then. But victory came with a price that nobody talks about. He took another drink, gathering courage for the hardest part of his story. The soldiers who came home from the war weren't the same people who left Earth. We had done things that no civilization should ask of its people. We had become something dark and terrible in the name of survival. The three cadets leaned forward, despite their obvious fear. Lieutenant, Amy Walsh was in my unit during the siege of Titan Base. Sweet girl from Ohio who wanted to be a teacher before the war started. She learned to set booby traps that would kill children if they played with the wrong toy. Jake's metal fingers drummed against the table. Amy couldn't stop seeing enemies everywhere after the war ended. Every alien on the street looked like a potential threat. Every unexpected sound made her reach for weapons that weren't there. The silence stretched uncomfortably. Jake continued. Amy tried to readjust to civilian life. Got a job at elementary school just like she always wanted. But she couldn't handle being around children. Kept thinking about the Zephyrian young who had died in her traps. Started having nightmares about human children being used as biological weapons. Koss's voice was barely a whisper. What happened to her? She killed herself 6 months after coming home. Left a note saying she couldn't live with what she had become. That the war had turned her into a monster, and monsters didn't deserve to survive victory. Jake's eyes were distant, remembering his friend's funeral. An empty casket because there hadn't been enough left to bury. Amy wasn't the only one. Suicide rates among human veterans were 40% higher than the general population. The people who saved humanity couldn't live with the methods they used to do it. He looked at each of the alien cadets in turn. Do you understand now? We won the war. We saved our species. But we lost something essential in the process. We lost our innocence. Our belief that we were fundamentally good people. Velth was crying. Again, her broken skin reflecting the dim bar lights like scattered diamonds. Was there no other way? Maybe. Probably. But we didn't have time to find it. When your species is facing extinction, you don't have the luxury of moral philosophy. You do whatever works and deal with the consequences later. Jake finished his whiskey and signaled for another. The consequences are still with us. Every human veteran carries the knowledge of what we're capable of. Every human civilian knows that their protection comes from people willing to commit atrocities in their name. Nix looked up from his shaking notes. Is that why you're telling us these stories? To warn us? Partly. Jake's new drink arrived. But mostly because the galaxy is making a dangerous mistake. Politicians and military leaders from other species want to learn human warfare techniques. They think our methods are just another set of tactical innovations. The horror in the cadets' faces deepened as they understood the implications. They don't realize that human warfare isn't about technology or strategy. It's about psychology, about the willingness to sacrifice everything, including your own moral identity, for survival. Jake took a sip of his fresh drink. Other species can't fight like humans because they're not desperate enough. They haven't faced true extinction. They still believe in honor and rules and civilized behavior. Koss found his voice. You think that makes them weak? I think it makes them lucky. Jake's smile was sad and tired. The Galactic Coalition wants to create joint military training programs. Teach alien officers how to fight without honor, how to target civilians, how to destroy their own people rather than lose them to the enemy. The three cadets exchanged horrified glances. They were beginning to understand why Jake had agreed to tell his stories. What happens when you teach these methods to species that haven't been forced to use them? When you give psychological weapons to people who don't understand the cost of using them? Jake stared out the bar's viewport at the stars beyond. You create monsters without necessity. You turn warfare into something so terrible that peace becomes impossible. Velth spoke softly. What do you want us to do with this knowledge? Remember it. All of it. The tactics and the prices. The victories and the costs. Jake turned back, to face them. When you become officers in your own militaries, when politicians ask you to study human warfare methods, remember what those methods do to the people who use them. He stood up and dropped credits on the table for the last time. War should be the last resort, not the first option, because once you cross certain lines, you can never go back. once you become the kind of people who can win wars like the Terran Zephyrian conflict, you can never again be the kind of people who deserve peace. The three cadets remained seated as Jake walked toward the exit. Behind him, he could hear them talking in hushed voices. They would carry these stories with them for the rest of their lives. They would share them with others. The knowledge would spread. At the door, Jake paused and looked back one final time. The war ended 2 years ago, but it's still going on inside every human who fought in it. We saved our species by becoming something we're not sure we can live with. Remember that the next time someone suggests that war is glorious or necessary or honorable. He walked out into the corridor of Harmony Point, leaving the three young aliens to wrestle with knowledge that would change them forever. His work here was done. Outside, Jake touched his metal arm and felt the familiar coldness. The peace would last as long as the galaxy remembered what humanity was capable of. His stories were a reminder written in blood and horror. But Jake wondered if memory was enough. If the lessons would hold when new generations forgot the cost of victory. If humanity itself would remember why certain prices were too high to pay. The stars beyond the station's hull were beautiful and cold. Somewhere among them, new conflicts were brewing. New species were discovering the harsh realities of survival. And humanity waited, scarred and dangerous, hoping never again to become the monsters that victory required. Jake walked toward his quarters, carrying the weight of knowledge that could never be forgotten. The war was over, but its ghosts would haunt the galaxy forever.